Within my studies in triple computer science, I have been given the opportunity to create a video essay detailing the social and technological impacts within the gaming industry and how they have impacted the players and the developers. A large trend within the gaming industry is the conversation of indie games versus AAA. Indie games have seen a massive surge in popularity in the past decade, with many smaller teams developing award-winning games that have made lasting impacts on the industry. One of the largest examples of an indie sensation being Mojang's Minecraft. Indie games are developed by much smaller teams with much less resources. AAA games are traditional games created by company-funded teams of much larger sizes, such as games created by the three big pillars in the industry: Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation. Indie games typically leave a much more consumer-friendly mark within their users, with actions such as allowing content creators to use music within the game, which has unfortunately been a shortcoming with many larger companies, such as Nintendo being infamous for taking down any video using music from any of their games. Indie developers are also much more supportive of fans wishing to make their own content for the game in the form of mods, which are normally off the table for most AAA games. A great example of this is the indie game Celeste. The game is about a girl named Madeline climbing a mountain called Celeste. The game was lauded for its amazing soundtrack composed by Lena Raine, as well as the composer's willingness to allow users to use the music within their own content. Lena also hosts live listen-along streams, allowing members of the community to listen to the music live along with other members. The choice to be more consumer-friendly towards players is very impactful within the industry, as it encourages not only the celebration of the games and the music created, but also the communities surrounding them. The relationship between developers and players is very symbiotic. Developers can't create games without players, and if players do not wish to spend money or time on a game, developers can't continue making them. And with large companies such as Nintendo disregarding this fact, it seems very outdated and depressing to see them completely disregard their community. The consumer-friendly attitude expressed by indie developers come from a passion of making games, and it makes smaller companies more memorable outside of just the games they create. By maintaining a positive consumer impact, the users, developers, and the industry will all greatly benefit. Another trend that has seen a lot more conversation recently is the implementation of digital rights management, or DRM. Digital rights management is a technology that allows game developers to implement piracy prevention methods into their games. The measures are typically as simple as stopping a player from progressing in the game if the game detects that it is an illegitimate copy. An example of this is Pokemon Black and White for the Nintendo DS. As Nintendo was aware of the rampant piracy problem on the DS, they implemented DRM that stopped players from gaining experience points in the game. This effectively made the game impossible to complete and would encourage users to buy a legitimate copy. Some developers use DRM in much less practical ways in order to mess with the users or joke at their expense, such as the DRM implemented within Alan Wake's PC release, in which gives the titular character an eye patch. Users also receive a reminder to buy the game during loading screens. DRM is generally seen as a non-issue in the gaming industry today, as many forms of DRM are cracked within weeks of a game's release. In general, it does very little to prevent users from pirating games. But in the case of CD Projekt Red and DRM, that is used to jab the player and give them a laugh, like in the case of Alan Wake, it makes users much more incentivized to buy the game. When reacting to the piracy of The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red famously said that they ultimately don't care if players choose to pirate the game, and they wouldn't chase players with the police, as a quote. However, they encourage users that pirated the game to think about purchasing the game after they have played it, or purchase future releases if they would like to support the developers. This garnered a lot of respect from players as well as people in the industry, because ultimately the more a company tries to stop piracy, the more people will want to pirate the game. Gabe Newell of Valve fame also weighed in on video game piracy, stating that it was an issue of game availability rather than game pricing. DRM can be helpful for developers in some cases, however it is becoming a lot more common, especially for indie developers, to not be too bothered by piracy, opting more to convince players to fund the development if they enjoy the game, or at the very least promote the game in order to encourage more people to try the game. In some isolated cases, DRM can harm the gaming industry, like with the PC release of Capcom's Resident Evil Village. The DRM that Capcom had implemented into the game had been notably affecting performance of the game, causing it to run significantly slower on official copies over those that were cracked, meaning pirated and with the DRM disabled. This caused players who bought the game to be justifiably upset with Capcom, with some users pirating the game just so they could play it even after purchasing the game legally. Capcom 1 week after would release a patch that would fix the issue that was seemingly caused by a DRM technology called Denuvo. This technology has been criticised in the past for demanding high CPU usage, causing the aforementioned performance issues. This left a large impact on not only the game's sales but the larger gaming community, with people arguing that DRM is more of a hindrance to users than a benefit to the developers. This is due to the lack of security DRM generally brings. Games that have DRM, especially ones that are highly anticipated, take almost no time to crack, with pirated versions of the game being available to download sometimes as early as weeks after the official release. With the reported performance issues of some games such as Resident Evil Village, the use of DRM can incentivize the very thing it tries to prevent. If an official version of a game has notable performance usage that hinders the performance, and an unofficial cracked version does not, most users would rather have a product that runs as smooth as it can on their system. DRM seems more and more outdated the more cases like this garner mainstream attention, and as someone who plays games officially on PC, it can feel quite alienating for games that I paid for officially to be bottlenecked to prevent piracy, despite the game being pirated in under a week. CD Projekt Red have also recently garnered praise from players through their choice to leave their highly anticipated game Cyberpunk 2077 DRM free. When asked about why they made this decision, Michael Plakal-Galuski said, "Each time we are thinking about a decision, the first rule is we have to treat gamers like we'd like to be treated. We don't believe in DRM because we hate DRM. It also doesn't protect, not really. Games are cracked in minutes, hours or days, but they're always cracked. If you want to pirate, you'll find a way. But if you're committed and are buying the game, why should we place a barrier on you? It is seeming more and more that DRM as a concept is helpful and could help the industry, but with the use of archaic and impractical uses of the technology, it aggravates players, doesn't help developers, and can actively hinder the gaming industry."
On another note, when considering how both of these concepts may change in the future, I genuinely believe that as time goes on, DRM will become increasingly more of a hindrance, to the point where it is omitted completely from future releases. There is already a large push for it from big players in the industry such as the aforementioned CD Projekt Red. DRM may still have a place in the industry, should a DRM technology be developed that does not hinder the player and actually protect against piracy. However, I find this very unlikely, due to the mandatory use of the computer hardware to perform the necessary checks to identify a pirated game. This sentiment seems like a common position to have, as there are multiple articles and online threads created to tackle the same issue, as well as speculate how it may change in the future. This even led to the creation of a platform solely focused on providing DRM-free games to users, called GOG.com. GOG.com is wholly owned by CD Projekt Red and has exploded in popularity over the past 5 years, with a library of games consisting of not only indie games but also AAA games. The distribution of these games has also been supported by the Prime Gaming service offered by Amazon, allowing users to claim a free game from other platforms as well as GOG.com that refresh every month. GOG originally started with much smaller games, primarily indie games and CD Projekt Red's first-party offerings. However, with its increase in users and more movement behind the idea of a DRM-free marketplace, it gained a large amount of traction, especially with its cheaper prices and regular sales, akin to Steam. The large following of this platform is, in my opinion, evidence of a real push within the industry to try and kick DRM so that games continue to provide a positive experience for users, developers and the industry. When talking about games in the industry, there is still a large disconnect between the terms indie and AAA, due to the large difference in the games themselves. Both can cover the same themes, genres and even gameplay styles, however these labels remain. Some people may make the assumption that these terms may eventually bleed into one, or no longer be relevant enough to users to separate them. I believe that in the future these two terms will remain, chiefly for two reasons. AAA games and indie games may produce similar products, however they are distinctive enough to still be relevant. It is very easy for someone to tell when a game is an indie game, due to the amount of attention to detail and passion you can feel when playing it. Even if the game itself doesn't look like an indie game, it's also quite easy to tell when a game is AAA due to their typically higher production. The other main reason I believe that these two will remain is the similar labels used in the music industry. Indie music has been around for decades, however it still remains a relevant label to use as it easily denotes to the listener what they could expect from the music, with indie music typically having much cheaper production budgets, despite producing otherwise similar results. These assumptions are very similar to what someone may assume about the indie and AAA games, therefore I believe the labels are still relevant.
In my opinion, the rise of indie development as well as the comparison between indie and AAA development is the most impactful in terms of the players, developers and the larger gaming community. DRM has been within games for almost as long as video games have been accessible to the general public, and it is slowly becoming more and more outdated. Indie development, like DRM, has been a concept for a very long time, but it is only within the past decade that indie development has seen a massive increase in both profits, accessibility and general audience response. With the rise of indie games, many industry standards and practices are being challenged as well as video game standards in general. An indie game outperforming a large AAA release was unheard of before the large boom in the past decade, and has been, in my opinion, very nice to see, as companies such as Ubisoft and EA have been infamous for selling buggy, incomplete games in an oversaturated market, have been made an example of by indie creations such as Minecraft, Enter the Gungeon, Hollow Knight and the Ori duology, in not only polish, but also community interaction. As with many indie games, the developers that are much more supporting of mods, song covers, and in general encouraging the community outside of just playing the game. DRM on the other hand has been a hindrance on developers and players alike, and negatively impacts the industry without any benefit, as the minimal security it provides can be circumvented within days. The only benefit it provides is that pirates can get a version of a game that initially runs better than the official release, until the official release is patched so that performance is not impacted as much. When the entire purpose is to prevent piracy, it seems counterintuitive. It punishes users who purchase the game legitimately and incentivizes piracy. Thank you for watching and listening.